In front of a room full of powerful people, a senator mocked the poor maid. She can't even read the menu. Everyone thought she would bow her head in shame. But just seconds later, she silenced the entire room using a language no one expected. That night, Senator Marcus Bowden's mansion blazed like a fortress of power. Luxury cars rolled slowly past the wrought iron gates, their wheels gliding over granite stones like they were treading an invisible carpet of influence. Headlights swept across polished limestone walls where black-suited guards stood stiff and still, their eyes as cold as ice. Inside, the grand hall glowed under dozens of Austrian crystal chandeliers, each crystal scattering light into glimmering shards across the smirking faces of the guests. The air was thick with expensive perfume, aged Bordeaux wine, and the rich scent of hand-stitched leather armchairs. This wasn't a party. It was a stage where the wealthy played their roles. Politicians, tycoons, power brokers, people who believed the fate of the city. Perhaps the entire nation rested in their hands. Into this perfect silk canvas, Lucia appeared like a smudge of ink. She wore a simple maid's uniform, a form-fitting black dress, a crisp white apron, still carrying the faint scent of cheap detergent. Her leather shoes were worn at the heels, the tips slightly scuffed from brushing against the stone floor too often. Her hair was neatly tied back, though a few strands clung to her sweat-dampened cheeks. Around her thin wrist, an old chipped watch ticked on faithfully. It was the only keepsake left from her father, who had passed away when Lucia was just 17. The scent of bleach still clung to her hands, mingling with the aroma of scented candles and fine wine. Her steps were so light they seemed not to touch the floor, yet her soles burned. She had worked non-stop that day, scrubbing, polishing, carrying, cleaning. Now, just before 10 o'clock, her legs threatened to give out. And yet in her dark eyes there was still a glow, something quiet, unspoken, and hard to define. She carried a silver tray carefully arranged with glistening glasses of champagne. The crystal light refracted through the pale golden liquid, casting trembling streaks of light on the walls. She moved silently through clusters of guests, overhearing conversations that were half truth, half boast. Some spoke of billion-dollar deals, others bragged about private island vacations. Laughter rang hollow, and condescending glances slid past her as if she were nothing more than mobile furniture. As Lucia approached the central table, the loudest corner of the room, her heart began to race. Seated there was Senator Marcus Bowden, a man infamous for his arrogance. He wore a navy blue tailored suit, a bright red tie, and a blinding gold pin shaped like an eagle. His face beamed with charm, but his narrowed eyes always seemed to be scanning for a target to humiliate. Around him lounged familiar elites, tuxedo-clad businessmen, women draped in diamond necklaces so large they caught the light and made others squint. Lucia bowed slightly, placing a glass before him. But fate trembled. After more than 10 hours of non-stop labor, her hand wavered. The glass tilted just enough. A single drop of deep red wine spilled, blooming into a crimson stain on the pristine white tablecloth. Just one drop. But it struck like a gunshot. Marcus Bowden fell silent. He looked down at the stain, blinked once, then lifted his chin. A hush fell over the table just for a beat, before a cold, rasping laugh escaped from his throat. You see that Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying well beyond what was necessary. She can't even manage something as simple as serving a drink. I fear she probably can't even spell her own name. Laughter erupted around the table. A few guests covered their mouths with satin-gloved hands, but their eyes sparkled with amusement. Silk dresses shimmered under the chandeliers, and the clinking of glasses chimed in like cruel applause. Lucia stood frozen, her back-hunched eyes, downcast hands gripping the silver tray tight. A strained smile pulled at her lips, but inside her heart thundered. Her face flushed hot, her ears rang. Each burst of laughter struck like a slap across the face. She wanted to vanish, to run from this suffocating room. But her feet felt nailed to the cold marble floor. Marcus wasn't done. He tilted his chin, voice dripping with mockery. How pitiful. A maid at an elite gathering. And she actually thinks she belongs laughter again. Each sound hit Lucia's chest like a hammer. But then, amid the shame, something else stirred. A distant memory, a voice from years ago. Her old professor's voice, echoing across a university lecture hall in rich Latin veritas numquam perit. The truth never perishes. Lucia's chest rose sharply. Her eyes lifted slightly, catching the crystal light now flickering like sparks. The fear, the humiliation, it was coalescing into something else. Something powerful. The room was still laughing. Marcus Bowden still basked in his moment. But Lucia had made her decision. She drew in a deep breath. Her hand stopped trembling, her back slowly straightened. Her lips pressed into a firm line, ready to part. An ancient language was about to break the air, a language no one in that room of power expected to come from the mouth of a poor maid. Senator Marcus Bowden's mansion was more than just a home. It was a fortress built to flaunt power. Every marble wall, every oil painting lining the corridors, every intricately blown glass lamp seemed to declare with arrogant certainty, here power wasn't just held, it was displayed. As guests stepped into the heady scent of imported lilies towering in Italian crystal vases, they felt as though they were entering a living museum where the artifacts weren't hidden behind glass, they were paraded to overwhelm. Lucia walked through that space every day, yet never felt part of it. She was invisible, a shadow that slipped through the glow of luxury. Being a maid had taught her how to exist without being seen, to serve without a sound, to clean without leaving a trace, to appear when needed and vanish before anyone noticed. But in that invisibility, she became a vessel holding the most unvarnished fragments of truth this world had to offer. From scattered conversations and careless whispers, Lucia learned more than anyone suspected. She knew the elegant businesswoman had burned millions covering up a failed deal. She knew the smiling senator, hand in hand with his wife, kept his eyes glued to his young assistant. She knew the powerful men and women in that house were never without fear. Fear of losing their seats, their wealth, their fragile alliances. Lucia wasn't nosy. But when ears are forced to listen and eyes to see, the truth begins to accumulate. And in the quiet hours of the night, while polishing the marble floor until it reflected her exhausted face, Lucia would remember a different life. She once sat in a small, chalk-dusted lecture hall where the sound of Latin echoed through warped wooden window panes. Lucia had been a top student in classical literature. The poems of Horace, the orations of Cicero, they once flowed from her lips like music. Professors had called her the Latin flower of her generation. But then her father died, leaving behind a mountain of debt. Her mother fell ill and needed costly medicine month after month. The academic dream vanished. She left the lecture hall, closed her notebooks, and stepped into a life of labor. From the grand libraries of the university, Lucia plummeted into stifling kitchens, dimly lit service staircases, and banquet halls echoing with condescending laughter. The drop felt like falling off a cliff. But even in that darkness, the flame of knowledge inside her never went out. There were nights after grueling shifts when she would open her father's tattered old book fingers, trembling as they traced Latin lines. Her eyes, red with exhaustion, still lit up at the sight of familiar passages. It was her way of holding on to a self that was once a scholar, not a servant. Back at the party, Lucia drifted through the crowd like a wisp of smoke. Fragments of conversation reached her ears. Talk of the stock market, of upcoming election campaigns, of covert ties between corporations and government. Occasionally, sharp laughter sliced through the air like knives. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Bowden, a false son, drawing every gaze to himself. He had just secured the chairmanship of a powerful committee, and tonight's soiree was his victory parade. He raised his glass voice, booming with rehearsed gravitas about responsibility to the people, but his eyes, glittering with the wine of conquest, held nothing but pride and arrogance. Lucia approached with the tray of wine, feeling the heat radiating from the circle of power before her. Every step was a trial. Every forced smile, every mechanical nod sliced at her dignity like a blade. But still she moved forward because she had no other choice. The meager wages from this job were the very breath keeping her mother alive on that hospital bed. When the drop of red wine fell onto the white tablecloth, the world seemed to freeze. Lucia could hear the pounding of her own heart, feel every stare landing on her like a spotlight. In the harsh glare of the chandeliers, all other sounds faded, leaving only Marcus Bowden's laugh, loud, hoarse, and soaked in contempt. Then came his insult, like a bucket of cold water dumped over her head. A maid, who probably can't even read her own name. In that moment, everything came rushing back. Her mother's tear-stained pillow, her father's hand on her shoulder whispering, "Knowledge is the strongest weapon." The pages of books she had once devoured in the dead of night. All of it twisted into a storm within her. Lucia bowed her head deeply as if to accept defeat. But in her eyes a spark ignited. A small spark, but the kind that could ignite a blaze at any moment. Lucia stood there, hands trembling as she gripped the silver tray. The red wine had already seeped into the tablecloth, spreading into a circular stain like an open wound. Amid the crackling laughter, she felt herself shrinking so small she wished she could vanish. But no one would grant her that mercy. Marcus Bowden leaned back in his chair, raising his wine glass like he was toasting his own triumph. He glanced at Lucia, then at the crowd now watching with gleeful curiosity. And he smiled, not the smile of a statesman, but of a man about to finish off a helpless creature for sport. "You know," he began, his voice deliberately louder than necessary at important summits, "they say you must choose your servers carefully." Why? Because sometimes a single dropped glass can ruin the entire picture. And here, he swirled the wine in his glass, the liquid catching the light in a fiery red glow. "We have a painting smeared by clumsiness." The crowd chuckled. A few guests nodded, treating his cruelty as if it were some clever new proverb. Lucia clenched her hands so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Her mother's voice rang in her mind. "You must endure, Lucia. We need the money. Humiliation will pass. What matters is staying alive, keeping the job." But her heart screamed back, "No. Why must I endure this forever?" She bowed and murmured, her voice shaking. "My apologies, sir." Marcus scoffed, ignoring her. He waved his hand, motioning for her to pour more wine. Lucia bent forward carefully, pouring, watching each drop as though it were molten glass. But somehow her precision seemed only to annoy him further. "Good heavens," he sneered. "Why so tense? You look like you're about to write your college thesis or something." The table erupted in laughter again. Lucia bit her lip until it bled. A thesis. That was once her dream, her future. And now the very mention of it, flung so carelessly, was a blade twisting in a wound that had never fully closed. As Lucia stepped back, a woman at the table, blonde hair, gleaming crimson lips, draped in glittering diamonds, narrowed her eyes at her. "Marcus, you really should replace the staff," she drawled. "Look at her. Such a downer." At a party this elegant who wants to stare at that hollow face, Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Indeed." A room full of brilliance tainted by a shadow. Lucia froze. Those words stripped her of humanity, reducing her to a dull object, an old piece of furniture spoiling the view. From across the room, Mr. Frederick, the manager, watched nervously, sweat beading on his brow. He knew Bowden was a VIP, a man you didn't cross. With a subtle gesture, he signaled for Lucia to retreat to the kitchen. She gave a faint nod and turned to leave. But before she could take a step, Marcus's voice rang out again. "Wait. Let her stay. I want to see how long she can endure." Lucia stopped in her tracks. The room fell silent. Curious eyes locked onto her like spectators at a zoo exhibit, eager to watch her break. She drew in a deep breath, blinking back tears. She couldn't walk away. Her mother needed medication. Rent was overdue. Quitting meant losing everything. After that moment of humiliation, Lucia slipped into the kitchen for a brief reprieve. Heat poured from the ovens, and the thick smell of frying oil clung to the air like a heavy curtain. She leaned against the wall, clutching the silver tray, her breathing sharp and shallow. George, the aging sous chef and her longtime colleague, walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Lucia, don't let him break you. That's all he wants, to see you fall apart." Lucia shook her head. "I'm tired, George. So tired. All these years. I thought I'd be a scholar. Now I'm just a shadow." George exhaled slowly, his eyes full of quiet sympathy. "But you still carry light. I can see it in your eyes, there's still fire." Lucia didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the door, adjusted her apron, and dried her hands. No matter what, she had to step back out there. The party moved into its centerpiece, Senator Bowden's speech. The room fell silent, and the lights shifted to spotlight him. He stood tall, voice booming with theatrical confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is not just a celebration of my victory, but a reaffirmation of one truth. This country needs strength. It needs control, and it needs to keep the weak in their proper place." He paused, then glanced at Lucia, and smirked. The room erupted into applause, loud and thunderous. Each clap pounded against Lucia's chest like a hammer. They weren't just applauding a man, they were cheering on humiliation power unchecked and the crushing of those below. Lucia clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain still. But each word he spoke had been another spark tossed into the storm brewing within her, a storm now very close to breaking. After the speech, Marcus called for more wine. Lucia stepped forward, bottle in hand. He looked at her, narrowing his eyes. "Do you even know this label? Or shall I spell it out for you?" Laughter again. Someone whispered, "What a delightful little sport." Lucia poured the wine, her voice quiet but firm. Sir Chateau Margaux. 1996, vintage. One of Medoc's finest years. For a beat, the table fell silent, caught off guard by her precise reply. But Marcus, unwilling to let her have even a moment, burst out laughing. "Well, look at that. Smarter than I thought. Shame, though, knowing all that and still just a maid." Laughter erupted again. Lucia's vision blurred. The bitterness welled up in her throat. She could hear the thud of her heart, the tightness of her breath, the rhythmic clack of heels on marble. Every sound closing in, pressing, choking. The storm inside her was no longer waiting. It was rising. That night, after cleaning up, Lucia returned to her tiny rented room in a run-down tenement. Barely 20 square meters, the walls were damp with mold, the ceiling stained with old water damage. Inside, her mother lay on a worn-out bed, her face pale, eyes glazed from medication. Lucia sat beside her, taking the cold, frail hand in hers. Her mother smiled faintly. "Did you have a good day?" Lucia forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mama. Just a little tired." But her throat tightened. She couldn't tell her, couldn't speak of the humiliation, couldn't let her mother see how close she was to breaking. When her mother drifted to sleep, Lucia opened an old notebook. Under the dim yellow light of the desk lamp, the Latin pages came to life. She whispered the words, "Fortis fortuna adiuvat." Fortune favors the brave. Tears slid down her cheeks. Maybe, just maybe, these words could save her. In the days that followed, Bowden continued to retell his entertaining little anecdote at every party. "You know," he would say with a laugh, "I've got a maid at home, can't even read the menu. Ha ha." And each time, something inside Lucia withered. But with every retelling, the fire in her heart blazed stronger. She began to understand if she stayed silent, she would forever be their punchline. If she stayed silent, her mother would slip away and she herself would rot in that damp little room. No. One day she would rise. The next gala was held in a grander hall with a larger crowd. Bowden once again sat at the center, basking in the glow of influence. This time, Lucia could feel every stare, expectant, amused, hungry for the next show. Marcus tilted his chin toward her. "You there, maid. Come here. Read this menu aloud." He handed her a menu written entirely in Latin and French. His smirk curled. "Bet you can't read a word of it." Lucia took the menu. Her eyes moved swiftly over the text, every word familiar. These lines, once her daily companions, now returned like old friends. Her heart pounded. The room held its breath. She looked up, and in that moment, she wasn't a maid. She was a scholar, a child of knowledge, a keeper of a language none of these people had ever truly known. Her lips parted. Lucia lifted her head, her eyes gleaming under the crystal light spilling from the high ceiling. The menu in her hands trembled not from fear, but from the surge of power building inside her. The Latin words danced in her mind, alive again, whispering, "Speak, Lucia. This is your language. This is the voice of truth." The room fell into an uncanny stillness. Every guest froze, expecting another humiliating spectacle courtesy of their favorite senator. But the next moment, the silence shattered, not with sound, but with awe. Lucia spoke, not in English, not in the hushed, deferential voice of a servant, but in a voice shaped by ancient rhythm and clarity, strong and musical, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who will guard the guards themselves. The room jolted. Latin, rare, rich, and thunderous, had erupted from the lips of a maid. It rang out like a cathedral bell tolling for judgment. Marcus Bowden blinked, his smug smile faltering. He didn't understand it right away, but at the far end of the table a few scholars stiffened in their seats. They knew the quote well. Juvenal's satires, a timeless challenge thrown at the powerful who holds them accountable. Lucia continued, voice unwavering, steady as scripture, non est ad astra mollis et terris via. There is no easy way from the earth to the stars. She didn't just read the words, she delivered them like she was back on a lecture stage. "Senator Bowden," she said, calling his name clearly for the first time, each syllable sharp and deliberate. "You asked if I could read the menu. But this menu is not merely a list of dishes, it is a symphony of culture. Each item offers more than taste. It carries centuries of history." She pointed to a line on the page, "Rognon de veau à la Dijonnaise." Veal kidney with Dijon mustard. Did you know that recipe dates back to the 18th century, recorded in manuscripts, written in the very Latin you assume I couldn't read? The French built their cuisine atop this language, and tonight you mock me believing I don't understand what's been placed in front of you. She drew a breath. The hush in the room deepened, every ear pulled taut by the weight of her words. "But it is you, Senator, who does not understand. You fail to see that a dish can carry an entire civilization. You fail to recognize that this language, Latin, was once the key to knowledge in law and medicine in the arts. And yet you dare to mock me for supposed illiteracy." Bowden's fingers tightened around his wine glass. His face flushed not from wine, but from something far more dangerous, fury born of humiliation. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Language itself seemed to flee him. Lucia did not stop. Her eyes now blazed with the calm fire of someone who had been forged in silence. "I studied this language in the shadows of libraries. I once dreamed of being a scholar until life forced me into this apron. But knowledge, Senator knowledge, never dies. It sleeps in the heart, waiting for its moment to awaken." Then she lifted her chin, voice ringing like cathedral bells, "Omnia vincit veritas, truth conquers all." The hall went still. Those who had laughed now sat frozen, their eyes fixed on her, not with scorn, but with awe. No longer did they see a trembling maid. They saw a scholar. They saw an equal, perhaps even something greater. Marcus Bowden rose abruptly, trying to steady his voice, trying to command the room again. "Enough!" he barked, his tone wavering. "You're just a servant. Don't think a few damn words can change the truth." Lucia offered a faint smile, calm and composed. "You're right," she said. A party can't change the world. But sometimes a single word spoken at the right moment can change how the world sees a person. A low ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Then, hesitant at first, a few hands began to clap. The sound grew bold and undeniable. Marcus's eyes darted around seeking support. But Brittany, the blonde woman at his side, stared down into her wine glass, refusing to meet his gaze. Leland Pryor, his ever-eager sycophant, fidgeted with his tie, visibly unsure whether to follow or stay silent. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in years, Marcus Bowden felt alone. Alone in the very room he had built to remind the world of his power. At a table near the window, Professor Edmonds, a renowned historian, stood, his voice bright with excitement. "Incredible," he declared. "Flawless pronunciation, fluent delivery, and true feeling. This young woman doesn't just know Latin, she understands its soul. Senator, I dare say tonight she is the one who should be lecturing us." The applause erupted into a roar. More guests rose from their seats, one after another. The atmosphere shifted palpably. The weight of power, once centered on Marcus Bowden, was now gravitating toward Lucia. Lucia's fingers tightened around the small notebook tucked in her apron pocket, the one where she had copied Latin quotes for years. She had carried it like a secret, a relic of the life she once dreamed of. Tonight it had become her invisible sword. Marcus, flailing to regain control, forced a brittle smile. "Well, what an amusing little performance. That's enough now. Let's get back to the party." But no one moved. No one turned away. Every gaze remained fixed on Lucia. She was no longer a shadow. She was the center of the room. Lucia bowed her head slightly, her voice now soft but resonant. "I apologize if I disrupted the evening. But remember, sometimes the smallest among us carry the most noble truths. Not everyone can afford fine wine, but everyone can drink from the wellspring of knowledge." A thunderous wave of applause swept through the hall this time, without hesitation, without restraint. The entire room stood clapping, not for a maid, but for a mind and for a moment that none of them would forget. Senator Marcus Bowden collapsed into his chair. His face darkened, his hand trembling. He had spent his life mastering every room with his voice, his power, his wealth. But tonight a maid had seized the floor from right under him, armed with nothing but a language he had dismissed. In that forced silence, Marcus was no longer a blazing sun. He was a flickering ember, fragile and alone, trembling in the wind that carried truth. Lucia turned and stepped away from the spotlight. But her head was held high, her shoulders square. She was no longer a servant fading into the background. She was a warrior, one who had just declared her existence to the world. After the party, the story spread like wildfire. Everyone retold the scene, the maid who stood tall and recited Latin, silencing a senator. The tale evolved, with every telling embroidered with awe and admiration. From whispers in drawing rooms to murmurs at boardroom lunches, her name was no longer unknown. Lucia had no idea. She returned to her daily life, unaware that the moment she had seized, fueled by pain, knowledge, and courage, had become a spark. A small spark, but enough to scorch the polished armor of Marcus Bowden's arrogance, and enough to begin lighting a new path, one that now waited for her to walk it. The night lights of New York cast their glow down onto the city's skyscrapers like upright swords, cold and gleaming. In the highest room of a glass tower that bore his name, Marcus Bowden sat in silence. His broad hand clenched a glass of whiskey, fingers trembling slightly. In his mind, Lucia's Latin still echoed each syllable, driving deeper like a dagger, omnia vincit veritas. Truth conquers all. He couldn't let that phrase spread. He had lost control in his own arena in front of his own audience. And in politics, humiliation was a stain that never faded. He needed to erase it. And there was only one way to do that: destroy the girl who had dared to challenge him. The next morning, Lucia was called into the manager's office. Mr. Albrecht, the Bowden estate's silver-haired administrator, looked at her with a deep furrow in his brow. "Lucia," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. The senator has requested your contract be terminated, effective immediately." She stood frozen. Even though she had braced herself for this moment, the words still struck like a blade to the heart. No job meant no medicine for her mother. No job meant everything she had held together with hope was now falling apart. But something unexpected had happened. News had traveled faster than she had. One of the guests at the party, Professor Edmonds, had recounted the entire scene to a prestigious intellectual journal. The article, titled "The Maid Who Spoke Latin and What She Taught the Powerful," spread like wildfire. On street corners, in cafes, and college classrooms, the name Lucia began to take root. She became a symbol not of defiance, but of something deeper: truth, unrecognized intellect, and the undying power of knowledge. Marcus Bowden, enraged, launched his full PR machine into action. Smear articles flooded the tabloids. Lucia, fake scholar maid or manipulator claims surfaced that she had cheated on exams, been expelled, even shoplifted in her teens. None were true, but in politics, truth was less important than noise. In her tiny room, Lucia curled up, watching her phone vibrate non-stop. Friends, former professors, reporters. Her mother coughed violently, nearby eyes filled with worry. The world felt like it was collapsing again. And then a letter arrived. Not anonymous. A white envelope with the crest of Columbia University, from Professor Edmonds. Inside, handwritten in neat script, "Lucia, I saw it with my own eyes. You didn't just pronounce Latin correctly, you captured the soul of classical thought. I believe in you, and I will stand as witness to your talent and your character. Don't let them take the voice you fought to reclaim." Lucia's hands trembled as she gripped the letter, and within her a spark caught flame once more. A few weeks later, Marcus Bowden staged a major congressional hearing centered on culture and education policy. He framed it as a call to action to restore academic standards and reclaim his image as a champion of intellectual values. Lucia never expected an invitation. At first, she suspected a trap, but then came a quiet message from Professor Edmonds: "Come. This is a chance for truth to be heard." The day of the hearing, the grand hall was packed. Senators, professors, journalists, students, every seat filled, every eye expectant. On the main stage, Marcus Bowden stood tall in a flawlessly tailored black suit. His confident smile had returned, rehearsed and gleaming. Lucia sat quietly in the guest section. Her gray dress was modest, unobtrusive, but her eyes, they burned bright with a quiet fire that refused to go out. Marcus opened with rhetorical flair, "Education is the backbone of our nation. But let's be realistic, not everyone is meant to be a scholar. Society needs workers just as it needs leaders." A wave of murmurs swept through the hall. Everyone knew what he was doing. He wasn't just making a point. He was drawing a line and placing Lucia squarely on the other side of it. A living example of someone who, in his eyes, never belonged at the table. When Lucia was invited to speak, she rose slowly. Her footsteps echoed sharply across the marble floor, cutting through the whispers. She stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lucia. Yes, I was a maid. I scrubbed floors, carried trays, was looked down upon. But I was also a student. I read Cicero, Horace, Virgil. I studied because I believed knowledge doesn't belong to a class. It belongs to everyone." Marcus smirked from his seat. "Pretty quotations, my dear," he said. "But what use are they to society? We need action, not flowery words." Lucia turned toward him, her gaze calm, unwavering. "You're right, Senator. But let me remind you, in the very language you once mocked." She lifted her head, and her voice, firm, melodic, rang out in Latin, "Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto." I am human, and nothing human is foreign to me. The room stirred. Murmurs rippled like waves. The quote by the Roman playwright Terence was a declaration of shared humanity, a refusal to accept hierarchy over dignity. Lucia continued, Senator Bowden may believe a maid is unworthy of books, but history shows us that those cast aside are often the ones who change the world. Knowledge is not a privilege. It is light, and anyone, even a maid, can carry that light forward. The entire chamber rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the hall, echoing off marble and wood. Marcus turned pale. He forced a smile, but it froze brittle and false. A journalist clicked away furiously, camera flashes bursting like fireworks. Within hours, headlines would race across the media. Maid challenges senator in Latin live at the Capitol. Then from across the room, a voice rang out sharp and cutting. It was an opposing senator standing tall with arms crossed. Senator Bowden, if an ordinary citizen understands dignity more deeply than you do, what right do you have to speak on behalf of this nation's education? Marcus opened his mouth, searching for a retort. But nothing came, just silence. Lucia took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears not of fear, but of release, of quiet triumph. She had reclaimed everything: her dignity, her voice, and the unshakable truth that knowledge can never be buried. As she stepped down from the podium, students and professors surged toward her, hands outstretched. Professor Edmonds approached, his smile warm and proud. "Lucia," he said gently, "today you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for millions who've been dismissed. And history will remember." Lucia bowed her head, her heart full, her soul alight. Behind them, Marcus stepped back from the stage. His face was hollow, sunken. He understood. The battle was over, and he had lost. Not to protest, not to scandal, but to the sound of Latin echoing across the hall. He had been defeated by a maid he once thought was dust. That night back in their tiny room, Lucia sat beside her mother and told her everything. Every word, every moment. Her mother clasped her hand, tears glistening in her eyes this time, not from pain, but pride. "Your father always said knowledge is a weapon," she whispered. "Today, you proved it." Lucia smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual noise, but within her, everything had stilled. She was no longer a shadow. She had become a symbol. The next morning, newspapers blazed with headlines: "The maid who stunned the Senate." One Latin phrase that shook the powerful. Bowden silenced, Lucia speaks. On social media, the video of Lucia quoting Terence in flawless Latin spread like wildfire. Millions of shares, thousands of comments. Students, teachers, factory workers, cafe servers, people from every walk of life saw themselves in Lucia's eyes. One post read, "She didn't just speak Latin. She spoke for all of us, those who've been dismissed because of our station." Another, "I cried. A maid reminded us that knowledge doesn't belong to any class. Thank you, Lucia." In her cramped little room, Lucia sat before her computer, overwhelmed as the tidal wave surged toward her. Messages flooded in from strangers, supporters, and scholars alike. She was no longer a shadow. She had become a symbol. Meanwhile, Marcus Bowden faced the darkest days of his career. The simmering investigations into his murky financial dealings, once quietly ignored, were now reignited by overwhelming public scrutiny. Corporations, universities, and former allies began to distance themselves. One after another, they issued statements severing ties. In an emergency session, the Congressional Ethics Committee voted to strip Bowden of his chairmanship over the National Cultural Center project. On television screens across the country, the image was stark. Bowden slumped in his chair, pale, drained of his former power. The once booming name now echoed only as a symbol of public disgrace. When a reporter called out, "Senator, do you have anything to say to Lucia, the woman who silenced you in the chamber?" Marcus Bowden lowered his head. He said nothing, not a word. Amid the chaos, an unexpected door opened for Lucia. Professor Edmonds, alongside other respected scholars, advocated for her to receive a rare, specially designated scholarship from Columbia University, a program reserved for those who had once lost their academic path but demonstrated extraordinary talent. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing Columbia's official crest. With trembling hands, Lucia opened the envelope. Bold print greeted her eyes. "We are honored to inform you that Ms. Lucia Marquez has been accepted into the Classical Studies program. All tuition and living expenses will be fully covered." She burst into tears, not of helplessness, but of release, of redemption. A dream once buried had come back to life. Clutching the letter, Lucia ran back to the small room where her mother sat propped up in bed. The frail woman looked at her with concern until she saw the radiant smile breaking across her daughter's face. Her eyes welled with tears of her own. "You've returned to knowledge, my girl," she whispered, her thin fingers gripping Lucia's hand tightly. "If your father were alive, he would be so proud." Lucia buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Years of struggle, heartbreak, and silence now answered by this one moment of grace. It was the reward she had earned. That September, Lucia walked into the lecture halls of Columbia, not as a cleaner, but as a student. On the first day, she took a seat in the front row and opened a brand new notebook. At the front of the room, the professor chalked a Latin phrase onto the board, "Initium sapientiae timor domini." The beginning of wisdom is reverence. Lucia looked up and smiled. It was no longer fear of shame she carried, only reverence for learning, and a quiet gratitude for this second chance. New classmates greeted her. One, recognizing her, leaned over with wide eyes. "Are you Lucia? The one who made the whole Senate rise to their feet?" She blushed, replying softly, "No, I'm just a student who loves language." But in their eyes, she knew. Her story had become something greater than herself. It had woven itself into the shared memory of a city, a symbol that would linger long after the applause had faded. One evening, as Lucia studied by the soft glow of her desk lamp, an unmarked envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper scrawled in rushed, shaky handwriting. "You've won. But remember, politics is a battlefield that never sleeps. Hold on tight to the light in your hands. No name, no signature." But the handwriting, trembling, hurried, was unmistakably Marcus Bowden's. Lucia read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in her drawer. There was no hatred in her heart, only a quiet pity for a man who had lost his soul in the game of power. She understood now. The greatest victory wasn't bringing an opponent to ruin. It was walking through fire and remaining whole. In the depths of winter, snow blanketed the streets of New York in thick, silent drifts. Lucia walked home, a bag of medicine tucked under her arm. The rented room was still small, the walls still stained, but inside a warm light glowed from a single lamp. Her mother sat by the window, wrapped in a woolen scarf. Lucia sat beside her, pulled out a worn Latin book, and began to read aloud. Her voice was low and rich, carrying them both into an ancient world of words and wisdom. Her mother listened, eyes shining, her illness momentarily forgotten. "Lucia," she whispered, "you've proven that no matter how humble the beginning, you can step into the world of knowledge and stand beside anyone. I am so proud of you." Lucia squeezed her hand gently. "No, Mama," she said. "I'm only walking the path you lit long ago with those old books in this tiny home." And so they sat for the long time while the snow fell quietly outside, and within the soft light of a boundless love kept the winter at bay. A year later, Lucia stood at the podium of the Classical Studies commencement ceremony. The auditorium was packed. Once a maid in silence, she now stood in a deep blue graduation gown, eyes bright with quiet confidence. She began with the language that had transformed her life, Veritas liberabit vos. The truth shall set you free. Thunderous applause erupted. Lucia scanned the crowd, young, eager faces glowing with hope. And in the front row, her mother, tears shining in her eyes, hand pressed to her heart. "Maybe I'm not like most of you," Lucia said, voice thick with emotion. "I once scrubbed floors. I was overlooked, laughed at, humiliated at a luxurious banquet. But through those moments, I learned one thing. Knowledge is the one weapon no one can take from you. It may sleep, but given a single chance, it will awaken and it can change everything. Never let anyone define you by the job you hold. We are more than labels. We are possibility. We are potential. We are hope. And most importantly, we are human, equal and dignified. The applause surged like a tide. Students rose to their feet, many wiping tears. And at the center of it all stood Lucia, no longer a story of survival, but a living testament to the enduring power of truth. That night, Lucia walked alone across the Brooklyn Bridge. The city glowed beneath her, its endless river of headlights flowing like a restless current. She paused, midway, breathing in deeply, letting the cold wind sting her cheeks. From a scorned maid to a student, a speaker, a symbol, her journey had not been a miracle. It was sweat. It was tears. It was the unyielding choice to rise again and again. She looked up at the faint stars barely visible through the city haze and whispered the Latin phrase that had once saved her omnia vincit veritas. Truth conquers all. A soft smile touched her lips. The future stretched wide ahead, uncertain, full of trials. But now Lucia was ready. Lucia's story reminds us, no one has the right to take knowledge away from you. Social status never defines true worth. A single moment of courage can change an entire life. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. What do you think is the most powerful weapon a person can have? Money power or knowledge? Share this video to help remind others that no act of contempt is stronger than the truth. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss more heartfelt, inspiring, and deeply human stories.